archivist at Forbes Library. We are recording tonight's program, so if you have friends who missed out, we will send out the recording in a few days when it's ready. Anyone who registered, it'll also be on our website. I'd like to begin tonight also by acknowledging that Forbes Library and the Coolidge Museum stand on Nunatak land. I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to our south, and the Abenaki to our north. Myself and Bill Scher join you from the land of the Nunatak, and Rushad Thomas joins us from the land of the Piscataway. Tonight, our subject, the 30th President, Calvin Coolidge, was born on the land of the Abenaki. Tonight's program is Opening the Door to Hope, Coolidge and Civil Rights. A little bit about our speakers. Rushad Thomas is a native of Central Florida. He's currently the policy advisor on domestic policy and migration in the Episcopal Church Office of Government Relations. After working 3 years on civic education and historic preservation and interpretation at the Calvin Coolidge Foundation in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, he made his way to Washington, D.C., where he's worked for a variety of nonprofit organizations in education and policy and political action committees. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Florida A&M University, a master's degree in government and a graduate certificate in political management from Regent University, and a master's degree in political communication from American University. We are doing tonight's program in an interview style format rather than a straight lecture. And Bill Scher will be serving as our interviewer and commentator. Bill serves as vice president of the Coolidge Standing Committee at Forbes Library. He leads the library's president's book group to share his passion for discussing presidents and politics. And if you'd like to join that group, we're taking December off, but we will be discussing Lincoln in January. And I'll put in the chat, you can get in touch with us to sign up for that group. Bill is a contributing editor to Politico magazine and a contributor to Real Clear Politics. He co-hosts the bipartisan online show and podcast, The DMZ, and recently launched a history podcast titled When America Worked. We will be taking some questions at the end. We have a few that were emailed to us ahead of time as well. You can put a question in the chat box, or on Zoom, it lets you raise your hand. Or you can also send me a message in the chat if you'd like to ask your question yourself. So we'll turn it over to Bill.
Thank you so much, Julie. And let me just also start off by saying that on the Coolidge Library website, which is within the Forbes Library website, we have a page of resources about Coolidge's record on African-American rights, Native American rights, and immigration policy. Which is very complex, and it is our charge as a library and museum not to tell you what to think about it, but to give you the information that exists so you can draw your own conclusions. And this event is in that spirit. I love the work that Rushad has done, and I have high respect for it, but I'm not here to tell you that you should agree with everything he has to say. This is the only way to look at Coolidge's record, but it's a great opportunity to explore all of the nuances and complexities of it. So Rushad, let me just, before we get into Coolidge specifically, can you give a little bit of the lay of the land? What is the context of America and race relations, at the point that Coolidge enters office and in the years preceding that moment?
Well, thanks so much, Bill, and thank you, Julie and Forbes Library and everyone for having me. It's a great honor to be joining you today and to have the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite historical subjects, Calvin Coolidge. So I hope everyone will enjoy the discussion and learn a little something, and hopefully be a little more enriched by the end of the conversation. So to your question, race relations in the United States and in the eve of the 1920s was, of course, very fraught. When Calvin Coolidge ran for president he ran for vice president in 1920, exactly 100 years ago. on the ticket with Warren Harding. We were, of course, coming out of the First World War, and African American soldiers had participated in that conflict, and many of them had gotten honors from foreign governments like the French government for their valor in the war. But then they came home to the United States, to communities that were deep in the throes of Jim Crow and segregation and the like. And it was also a period when there was a great deal of racial violence, in addition to just the everyday indignities of the Jim Crow system. So you had a number of very serious race riots and racial violence that took place. The most prominent being the Greenwood massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that took place in the summer of 1921, and that was the worst racial riot in American history. I think 300 people were killed, and the Greenwood community was the wealthiest Black community in the country at the time. And another one that took place around this time actually occurred in a community not far from where I grew up in Central Florida, the Rosewood Massacre. And there was a really beautiful movie that was done about that massacre in the mid-90s that I encourage you all to watch. But yeah, so the situation was very dire. Going back even further, of course, the Republican Party, which Calvin Coolidge was the standard bearer for, had been at the vanguard of liberation for African Americans. Of course, it was the party of Abraham Lincoln, had liberated the enslaved folks of the South from slavery through the winning the Civil War. And then in the decade or so, roughly after the Civil War, African Americans in the South achieved tremendous political, social, and economic and educational progress in the South, elected African Americans to Congress, to the US Senate, and to the US House. The majority in the South Carolina legislature was Black in the early 1870s, and things were getting better, markedly better from the time of enslavement in a very short period of time. But of course, history went on, and the Reconstruction advances were rolled back after the Compromise of 1877, when to settle a disputed election, the Republicans and the Democrats decided that in exchange for the White House being given to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, and then thus all protection for African Americans. So over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, all the rights and progress that had been made during Reconstruction were gradually withdrawn in the southern states. African Americans had very limited access to jobs, to almost no access to the vote in southern states. The few African Americans who did have the franchise in this time period lived in northern or western states. The political oppression was less pronounced in the north and in the west, even though there were still, outside of the South, Blacks still faced serious challenges from de facto segregation, if not de jure segregation. And throughout this period, Blacks were by and large part of the Republican Party, because the South was solidly Democratic, to the point where in many presidential elections, the Democratic nominee would win north of 95% of the vote in many southern states, which is astonishing when you think about it. But the Democrats were the party of segregation, the party of Jim Crow, very stalwart in defending Jim Crow. And I know we were discussing Woodrow Wilson a little bit before the formal conversation began, and Wilson was a Democrat, and one of the themes of the Democratic Party's situation throughout this period was having to appease this very large and loyal segment of the Democratic Party that was composed of white Southerners. So that aspect of party management was a huge part of every Democratic president's agenda right through the 20th century. So the Republican Party, of which Coolidge was a part, had some residual loyalty to African Americans because of the role that the Republican Party played in the liberation of African Americans back in the 1860s. But the GOP as well was not eager to expand rights for African Americans, owing in part to its desire to break the back of the solid Democratic South. I mean, a lot of Republican politicians looked at the situation. I mean, we think about the Southern strategy as something that took place in the 60s and 70s with Richard Nixon and Lee Atwater and whatnot. But Republican presidents and politicians had been looking at this treasure trove of white votes in the South for decades prior to that, and thinking, what can we do to make the Republican Party more appealing to Southerners? And one of the things that they did was de-emphasize rights for African Americans. So, unfortunately, that was a part of the calculus as well. So, this is the situation that we're coming into as Calvin Coolidge is coming on the national stage, becoming vice president and then president. And I should also mention one more thing, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan as well. So the second wave of the Klan came about in the 19-teens and into the 1920s. The Klan had been founded back in the 1860s as a terrorist organization to intimidate and perpetrate violence against African Americans in the South who were exercising their newfound rights. But it had fizzled out in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s as the project of quote unquote Southern redemption had gotten underway in earnest. But it came back up in the 19-teens, 1920s, but with a new sort of veneer, a new attitude. It sort of billed itself in the latter period, in the teens and 20s, as sort of a fraternal benefit society, a men's club, an organization standing in defense essentially of white Protestant American nationalism. And as a result of that, it in addition to having African Americans in their crosshairs, that did not change. But they also build themselves as an anti-immigrant organization, and particularly anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish. So we'd had huge waves of immigration from South and East Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that had transformed the demographics of the country. Huge demographic changes with those populations coming in. People from places like Italy and Greece and Slovakia and Poland and Russia, and those people, by and large, were not Protestant. Many of them were not Christians. They were Jewish. They were the ones from Southern Europe were either Roman Catholic or Orthodox. So their religion was strange, their language was strange, and they were seen as a fifth column, essentially. So the KKK exploited that in their campaign of resurgence in the 1910s, 1920s. So that was a very long answer to that question.
But an important one.
Basically, the gist of the situation as we're going into the 1920s with President Coolidge.
So with that context in mind, how do you judge the Calvin Coolidge record on civil rights?
That's a big question. So I think President Coolidge has to be understood certainly in all things, in every aspect of his record, in the context of his times. So we were in a time period in American history where African Americans, throughout all of the struggles and the trials that African Americans have faced over the course of 400 years on this soil, African Americans have always campaigned and advocated for their own rights. And that was no different in the 19-teens, 1920s. African-American organizations and leaders were constantly knocking on the doors of people of power, advocating for political rights and economic and civil rights as well. And President Coolidge, he certainly was not as amenable to direct action as we probably would want him to have been. I commented before the discussion to you, Bill, that I think any president who's done less than Lyndon Johnson for Black people leaves much to be desired, in my view. But I think in the context of the time, Calvin Coolidge was much more amenable to hearing out the concerns of African Americans and speaking out for the rights of African Americans than many other presidents of his era. I know at the beginning of his presidency in 1923, in the months immediately after that fateful night in Plymouth Notch, when his father, John Coolidge, administered the oath of office to him, he received a number of prominent African American leaders at the White House, including William Monroe Trotter, who pressed him on a number of issues that they wanted to see action on. And those issues included ending the segregation of the federal workforce, which President Wilson had unfortunately brought back in during his presidency in the 19-teens. It included support for a veterans hospital that existed at Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama. And now President Coolidge had actually visited Tuskegee earlier in the year in 1923. I believe it was in February, to dedicate the Veterans Hospital there for African-American veterans. Tuskegee, I should note, was founded by Booker T. Washington, who was a prominent African-American leader. I think he was already dead by then, but it was founded by him in the late 1800s to be a place where African-Americans could go to get education, particularly in sort of vocational fields. And he was not as interested, Booker T. Washington was not as interested in pressing for an end to segregation and support for civil rights legislation and voting rights and that sort of thing. He was much more interested in self-improvement for African Americans so that they could flourish within their own community. And other leaders in the Black community were very at odds with him. So this is this struggle between Booker T. Washington's vision and the vision of the Niagara movement that eventually founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and leaders like W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the Niagara movement and the NAACP. Was a perennial clash within the Black community. And then William Monroe Trotter, who was a newspaper, African American newspaper publisher from Boston, who visited Coolidge in the fall of 1923. He was more on the W.B. Du Bois side of the ledger. And apparently those overtures from African American leaders had an effect on President Coolidge, because in his first State of the Union address on December 6, 1923, and the only State of the Union address that President Coolidge actually delivered in person in the House chamber to a joint session of Congress. Sidebar, that was not the normal course of things. For most of the history of the Republic, State of the Union messages were delivered in writing to Congress. They weren't the big media and spectacles of state that they are today. But President Wilson, I believe, was the first president to deliver the address in person. But President Coolidge delivered it in person on December 6th, 1923, the only time he did so during his presidency. And in that speech, he actually spoke directly to some of these concerns that these Black leaders had brought to him. And I'm going to quote a little bit from his 1923 State of the Union address. He says, "Numbered among our population are some 12,000 colored people. Under our Constitution, their rights are just as sacred as those of any other citizen. It is both a public and a private duty to protect those rights. the Congress ought to exercise all its powers of prevention and punishment against the hideous crime of lynching, of which the Negroes are by no means the sole sufferers, but for which they furnish a majority of the victims. And I should note, I didn't mention lynching as one of the items that was brought up, but lynching was definitely one of the items that was brought up. Lynchings had increased substantially in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. Lynching is one of the most horrible forms of vigilante violence. If you ever get the chance to visit Montgomery, Alabama, I encourage you to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which has been established by the Equal Justice Initiative. It's a memorial to all of the victims of lynching over the course of American history, a very moving memorial. And it actually highlights where and the names of, if they're able to track them down, of the individuals who were lynched and the counties in the country where those lynchings took place. And it's not just places in the South. There were places in the North, the Midwest, and the West where lynchings occurred. So, and it was a huge issue within the African-American advocacy community in the early part of the 20th century. One of my favorite heroes, Ida B. Wells, cut her teeth as a journalist campaigning against lynching. And of course, you know, the leadership of the community in those days, anytime they had an opportunity to speak with a federal office holder, they brought up the issue of lynching. And the way that the dynamic in which it worked in Congress, unfortunately, was that oftentimes anti-lynching bills would pass the House of Representatives, but they would fail in the Senate due to filibusters that were led by Southern Democrats, unfortunately. And in those days, there was no way to cut off a filibuster. You had to have unanimous consent, no 60 vote threshold. I don't know how they got anything done in Congress in those days without even a 60 vote threshold. But that was the situation, unfortunately. Like a lot of civil rights proposals until the 1960s, anytime a president or others in Congress would propose something to advance the rights of African Americans, it would be vetoed essentially by Southern Democrats, either in the House or the Senate. So President Coolidge giving his endorsement to anti-lynching legislation in the State of the Union address in a chamber with, you know, Southern Democrats from the House and the Senate sitting there listening to him was a huge thing. So then to further quote from his State of the Union address, already a considerable sum is appropriated to give the Negroes vocational training in agriculture. This is speaking back to the whole Booker T. Washington approach to things. About $500,000 is recommended for medical courses at Howard University to help contribute to the education of 500 colored doctors needed each year. On account of the integration of large numbers into industrial centers, it is being proposed that a commission be created composed of members from both races to formulate a better policy for mutual understanding and confidence. Such an effort is to be commended. Everyone would rejoice in the accomplishment of the results which it seeks, but it is well to recognize that these difficulties are to a large extent local problems which must be worked out by the mutual forbearance and human kindness of each community. Such a method gives much more promise of a real remedy than outside interference. So that last line, I think, really speaks to Coolidge's political philosophy in a very direct way. Calvin Coolidge was an inveterate Federalist, and he preferred state solutions and local solutions to national solutions whenever possible. So he didn't want grand federal action on civil rights and whatnot that later presidents would take, but he definitely supported actions to help improve the lot of African Americans. He mentions Howard University in his State of the Union address. In 1924, in the summer of 1924, President Coolidge actually gave the commencement address at Howard University, which was a huge thing for the President of the United States to go to a historically Black institution and give the commencement address. Howard University was founded in 1867 by Congregationalists and named for Oliver Otis Howard, who was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau at that time. And it's actually, the institution has a tie to President Coolidge because the Congregational Church in Washington, from which Howard was founded back in 1867, the first Congregational Church, which is still a worshiping community to this very day. President Coolidge and Mrs. Coolidge were members of that church when they were in Washington. So in 1921, when they came to Washington as Vice President and Second Lady, they joined First Congregational Church and were members of that church through his presidency. And it was known actually as from the very beginning as one of the few integrated congregations in Washington. So the president, first of all, the fact that the president had even joined a congregation was revolutionary. Most presidents throughout history had not become formal members of any congregation in Washington. But the fact that not only did President Coolidge join a congregation, but he joined an integrated congregation was a very prominent signal, I think, that of his attitudes about African Americans. And his congregation there, First Church, would, during his presidency, host Marion Anderson, the famous African American opera singer, who we know, of course, because she was denied access to Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1941. And then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt resigned her membership of the DAR and then arranged for Marion Anderson to perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before a crowd of tens of thousands of people. So there's that link to the president with Marion Anderson, but she has this earlier link to the Coolidge family church, where she performed when she was much less prominent of a singer. We don't know if President Coolidge was present for the performance, or even if he knew about it or anything like that. There's no record of that, unfortunately. But that was his congregation, and the pastor, Jason Noble Pierce, was also an Amherst alum, actually. And when the organization that wanted Marion Anderson to sing, it was to benefit scholarships for African American women to attend Howard University. Pastor Pierce said yes immediately, and it was not even controversial on the part of the congregation. I'm sure other people, because Washington D.C. was a segregated city in the 1920s, so that having that concert was a huge deal, and I'm sure it wasn't lost on people that was the president's church. But again, we just don't know.
These personal gestures, these symbolic gestures, the rhetorical positions he took, the support he gave to Howard University, it all seems to fit within the Booker T. Washington model, but he wasn't following the W.E.B. Du Bois model of more direct action.
Right.
This is after W.E.B. Du Bois turned on the Republican Party after Taft, because Taft was taking the Republican Party in that direction, trying to win back some of the South. Du Bois endorses Wilson. Wilson then does the partial segregation of the federal workforce, so the Du Bois faction feels betrayed by Wilson. Is Coolidge's actions here enough to win him widespread praise from the Black community, or was there more of a mixed reaction because he was more on the Booker T. Washington side than the Du Bois side?
Well, as far as I can tell from the Black newspapers that I've read and whatnot, President Coolidge's actions were received favorably by African Americans. I don't think W.E.B. Du Bois was very warm to pretty much any president who came. God bless him. He was very adamant and very grateful for his adamance in supporting civil rights. But yeah, most of the sources I've read have been favorable. The contemporaneous sources, I mean, the Black newspapers and whatnot. The folks were very, very appreciative of President Coolidge's gestures, and the fact that he put that appropriation in to support Howard University and the training of African American doctors. That was very, very important gesture. And the, you know, in a time when even rhetorical gestures of support were few and far between from prominent white people, getting any sort of positive statements from, especially from the President of the United States, was huge. Because as I mentioned, you know, this was a time of serious anti-Black demagogic rhetoric and direct violence and suppression. You know, very it's mind-boggling even to think about and reflect on the situation of race relations in our country at the time. It was just really just appalling. So the president speaking up in support of African American rights and improvement for African Americans was a very well received thing at the time.
Now, what do you make of Coolidge's posture towards the Ku Klux Klan? I've seen people say that he stood up to the Klan, and I've heard it argued that he was too silent and was trying to finesse the issue politically.
Right.
Do you have an opinion how the overall record stands on that?
Right. Yeah, I think it's easy to fault President Coolidge for not directly addressing the Klan because it was such a prominent part of the national scene at the time. But politically, it would have been really difficult for President Coolidge to directly condemn the Klan because, as I mentioned earlier, the Klan had taken on a sort of, I mean, it's really kind of gross and mind-boggling to think about, but it really had become like the Elks Club, you know, or the Knights of Columbus, or, you know, the Freemasons. You know, it was like the men's club or whatever. You know, it was the social mores and the organizations that quote unquote mainstream whites supported and were a part of in those days were just not verboten. And many white people at that time were part of the Klan and supported the Klan's aims, and not just in this Old South, in states like Indiana, in Oregon, even in Massachusetts and Vermont, the Klan was active in the 1920s. So it would have been very, very difficult for President Coolidge to directly condemn the Klan during his presidency. But he did address the Klan sort of obtusely. He made a number of, and you haven't asked me about the immigration issue yet, but you know, he did sign this very restrictive immigration law in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, which of course, you know, you can have negative opinions about that. I certainly do. I'm very pro-immigration personally. But rhetorically, again, you know, it's this dichotomy between like actions and words. President Coolidge has some of the most really moving and eloquent words to say about the place of immigrants in our society. He gave a speech to the American Legion in Omaha, Nebraska in 1926, where he said that no matter whether your ancestry can be traced back 300 years on the Mayflower or 3 years from the steerage, we're all in the same boat now, you know, so that, you know, no matter how long you've been in the country, if you're an American now, regardless of where you came from or where your ancestors came from, you are an American. And it's important to point out that the Klan did sort of dissipate as the 1920s went on. It's difficult to determine what exactly that's down to. I think part of it may have been that the Johnson-Reed Act sort of allayed a lot of the fears that people had about immigration, specifically because it cut immigration down to a trickle. And so the issue just became less easy to demagogue on. But that is the case. The Klan decreased, and lynchings also decreased over the course of the 1920s. So that's good news. I don't think you can directly lay it at President Coolidge's feet, but again, he certainly gave rhetorical support for that sort of thing.
So speaking of the immigration law, the harshest quote that gets brought up by Coolidge, I'm trying to pull it up in front of me. Here we go. He wrote an article when he was vice president for Good Housekeeping about immigration. And this is a quote that I see people who are white nationalists quote to hold up Coolidge as an icon, and then folks on the left hold up to say Coolidge was terrible. He says, there are racial considerations too grave to be brushed aside for any sentimental reasons. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully. With other races, the outcome shows deterioration on both sides. So how do you square that paragraph, which was before he was president, 1921, I believe, with what you just quoted, speaking in Omaha, 1926, which is far more welcoming and pluralistic and practically multicultural?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think President Coolidge lived and operated as a politician in an environment where those sorts of racist views were a part of the mainstream conversation. This was the era of eugenics in particular, and these very strange racial theories that unfortunately a lot of them were adopted and picked up by the Nazis later in the decade and into the 1930s. And President Coolidge had to speak to that. Those, I think, looking at it from our perspective, hopefully more enlightened, we would obviously say that sort of talk is just appalling and not welcome in civilized society. But Coolidge had to be shrewd in how he approached different constituencies in the effort to maintain political support for the Harding administration, and then later for himself throughout his time as a politician. I will note that he did have strong support from the quote unquote ethnic communities like the Irish and the Italians when he was governor of Massachusetts and a politician in Massachusetts, and he won the few black votes that there were on the table in 1924 when he ran for president. And then also just to take it back to the KKK, the country, of course, overall was very racist in 1924. But the ardent racists at that time were really in the Democratic Party. And the 1924 Democratic National Convention, which was held at Madison Square Garden in New York City, has been referred to as the Klan bake because there were so many Ku Klux Klanners involved, and this was, I mean, a part of the Democratic Party's coalition management for 100 years.
Well, they fought over a resolution condemning the Klan for hours and hours, which I think they did technically condemn it, if I remember correctly, but by a very narrow vote.
Yes, that's true. And they nominated John W. Davis. It was actually the most ballots for a presidential nominee in history was the 1924 convention. It's more than 100 before they settled on their eventual nominee, who was from West Virginia originally. So sort of a in-between state, border state. But yeah, so the Democratic Party had these very serious internal conflicts over the place of the South and the position of the South within the party, that they had to, oftentimes very public tussles over, like at the 1924 convention and whatnot. It's almost 7:45, so I want to leave time for questions. But one more thing I would love to mention about President Coolidge's record. So at the end of his presidency in 1929, he left office on May 4th, 1929. His last action was signing a law to establish a national monument to the Negro. And so that obviously wonderful thing, but there was no funding attached to it. And with the Depression and everything else that was going on in society at the time, the idea fizzled out. Well, 50 years later, African-American members of Congress resurrect this idea, and instead of just a monument, they decide that it should be a museum. So after many years of negotiating and lobbying and advocating, during the George W. Bush presidency in 2003, they finally get a law through Congress to authorize the modern day equivalent of the National Monument to the Negro, which is the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. And that museum, which I encourage you all to visit when we're not in COVID times in Washington, which sits on the mall in the shadow of the Washington Monument, was dedicated in 2016 by our nation's first African-American president, Barack Obama. So I think it's a nice little circle of history that gets closed, that started with President Coolidge, but it's closed when we have our first Black president. So I think it's every time I visit the Smithsonian African American History Museum, I think of Calvin Coolidge and that law that he signed on his last day in office.
Well, we should move to questions. I want to correct myself though. The Democrats failed to condemn the Klan in 24 by a narrow vote. Not that they did condemn the Klan. There was a slim loss, but Klan not condemned in 1924. Julie, should we do questions via chat?
Yes, so I do encourage you to put questions into the chat. You could also virtually raise your hand if you prefer to ask the question yourself. I don't see anyone joining us by phone, so I think we do have everybody who's online.
While I wait for a question to come out, I'll ask you one more, Rushad. What do you make of Coolidge's motivations for advocating and signing the restrictive immigration bill? Because on one hand, you might argue he was racially motivated based on that quote that I read. But on the other hand, he seemed to have a very welcoming attitude about anyone who wanted to come to America and be American. So is there a way to square those data points and understand what was the motivation there?
Well, I think like so many things during the Coolidge administration, the immigration law was much more congressionally directed. So I think if President Coolidge didn't find it unconstitutional on its face, he would have signed it. It wasn't like today where the president is issuing statements of administration policy saying that this, if you don't put this, that, or the other thing in this law, I will veto it. So I wouldn't put too much on President. I wouldn't lay too much of the blame on President Coolidge's feet for the Johnson-Reed Act, but I do think it accurately reflected the spirit of the age as far as the views that people had about immigrants and particularly about the types of immigrants that the law was aimed at stopping from coming into the country. I think public opinion was just very, very racist towards immigrants in the 1920s.
Now, Coolidge did want to be more open to the Japanese, although there was a ban on Japanese immigration in the bill, but Coolidge was unhappy about that. Right.
And I think that was more down to foreign policy, trying to, maintain good relations with the Japanese Empire more than anything. But you're right, he did want the restriction on Japanese to be softened.
I think we have a question from Joel Wolf on the 1924 law.
Yeah, it's actually more of a comment. I mean, I'm a historian at UMass, and I work on the 1920s, and the 24 Law is really misunderstood by people because it's primarily anti-Asian, as you're picking, really anti-Chinese, and secondarily anti-Jewish, but it's not anti-Catholic because it exempts the Western Hemisphere. And more than 1 million Canadians come to the United States in the 1920s, most of whom are French Canadian. And of course, Mexicans go back and forth, who are not only Catholic, but are people of color. So it's really anti-Asian. I mean, its racism is about Asians, but it's also anti-Jewish because Eastern Europe is cut off, and Eastern Europe is synonymous with Jews at that point, not with Poles and other people.
Right.
And what's really interesting is in the congressional debate, exempting the Western Hemisphere is for, I mean, planters and others want that, they want cheap labor, but it's also for inter-American solidarity. And so it's the way in which isolationism is about the hemisphere, that we want to wall off the hemisphere from Asia and Europe, but we're totally fine with a kind of transnational movement of people as long as they're from the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Julie, you have a couple of questions in the queue?
Yes, so we have, what, if anything, did Coolidge have to say regarding race or immigration in his post-presidency?
I'm not sure what he had to say post-presidency. I think he pretty much kept out of politics, more or less, once he left office. He did campaign a little bit for Herbert Hoover in 1932. But beyond that, in retirement, he was happy to let the sitting politicians fight out political issues. But as I mentioned, he had a lot to say about African Americans, immigrants, and whatnot, and the place of immigrants in our society while he was president. And it's very difficult to square that earlier quote from 1921 with some of the beautiful, eloquent things he says about immigrants later on during his presidency. But that's just what the record bears.
Yeah, there is, he does publish an autobiography in 1929, as well as his other writings was a column, syndicated newspaper column called Calvin Coolidge Says. He wrote for 1930, 1931. The Coolidge Foundation is going to start next year putting those online. So that'll be some interesting things to read. They were usually about a paragraph or two, and sometimes seasonal, but he did have pretty much free reign to write about whatever he wanted in those. We do have
I will note, there's an audio version of the Calvin Coolidge autobiography that I recorded in 2014. It's on YouTube. So if anyone wants something to put them to sleep, you can listen to me read the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge on YouTube.
Amazing. And I see Marcia and David Holden have a question in the chat, but do you have a different question in the queue, Julie?
Yeah, there was one ahead of that one that said, if Coolidge was a strong Federalist, how did he think Jim Crow and segregation would end?
That's a good question. I mean, I really don't think we can do anything other than speculate on how President Coolidge thought they would end. It's possible that, he and many other Northern whites thought that it would just end sort of the way a lot of folks thought slavery might end, which, gradual realization of the backwardness of this system, and then, it would just fall away of its own accord. But of course, we know that, that was not to be. It had to be directly confronted, and direct action had to be taken to eradicate it. But in any matter, President Coolidge did view it very much as a state issue. He did not think that it was something that the federal government had the power to dictate to the states that they could not allow segregation. And that was the mainstream constitutional position given the Plessy v. Ferguson decision from the 1890s.
And I see from, I'm sorry, someone speaking up? I see from Marcia and David Holden, did Coolidge have much personal interactions with African Americans growing up in Vermont or living in Northampton before he entered serious state and national politics?
The short answer is no. I did the research on this when I worked at the Coolidge Foundation, President Coolidge never even met a Black person until he was in college at Amherst. So, Vermont was a super white state in the late 19th century, and it's a super white state today. But he did not have any opportunity to interact in person with Black people at that time. He would have known that Black people existed, but no interpersonal interactions with Black people until he was a young adult at Amherst.
Just to circle back to what was asked before about how Coolidge thought that Jim Crow might end, we actually have a quote that is part of our page of resources. This is from an academic paper by John L. Blair, A Time for Parting the Negro During the Coolidge Years. And his assessment was Coolidge's idealism, his own conviction that you need only to point out a man's error for him voluntarily to tread the path of the enlightened, and then goes on to say that was fatal to Negro dreams of a new era. But that does jibe with what you're saying, Rushad, that he thought people would get there on their own accord so long as you spoke rightly and with high idealism.
Right. Sounds like Coolidge.
Anything else in the queue there, Julie?
Nope, we don't have any other questions in the chat. Let me see.
I thought I saw it. Oh, someone sent a question to me privately. Did President Coolidge own slaves? And the answer to that would be no, for two reasons. One, slavery was abolished before he was born, actually. He was born in 1872, and slavery was abolished in 1865, so it would have been unconstitutional by the time Coolidge was around. But he was also from Vermont, and Vermont had abolished slavery in 1791. So it was the first state in the Union, actually, to abolish slavery. So no, President Coolidge would have been from the stock of abolitionist Northerners who were morally opposed to slavery out of that tradition, the old Whig tradition of Northern abolition.
I have one more for you. You've spoken about Coolidge's shrewdness politically. Is there an argument that some of the more enlightened rhetoric on his part had political motivation to it, trying to retain a hold of the Northern Black vote? Is there a cynical interpretation that he was doing it to try to keep the vote without going so far as to actually, stick his neck out and try to pass bigger pieces of legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a for the Republican side of the ledger, doing some things, small though they may be, rhetorical though they may have been, to appease the Blacks who had the franchise in that period was definitely a part of the equation. It was just a part of party management. No different, honestly, than the way that Democrats had to appease white Southerners as a part of their national party management through that era. So yeah, and it's interesting. I think the development of Black political alignment is one of the most fascinating stories of our country's history post 1865, because in a sense, Black people have always been sort of the redheaded stepchildren in both parties. Very loyal to the Republican Party from the late 19th century through the early 20th century, and it was really Franklin Roosevelt through the New Deal who began to peel Blacks away from the Republican Party. It was not civil rights and Lyndon Johnson. It was FDR. By the 1950s and 1960s, and again with the Great Migration that was starting in the teens and going into the 20s, where Blacks were moving from the South to the North and the West and the Midwest. So many, many, many more Blacks had voting rights than had previously had them as Blacks left the South. So they became more politically relevant. And I mentioned before the conversation began that the first Black congressman in the 20th century was elected in 1928 as a Republican from Chicago, south side of Chicago, Oscar DePriest. So Blacks were a part of the Republican Party, but Republicans were very sensitive, white Republicans were very sensitive to the accusation that they were a Black party and were very anxious to win the votes of Southern whites. So, talking out of one side of their mouth towards Black voters, but out of the other side of their mouth to white voters would have been just a necessary part of that sort of dance that they had to make. It wouldn't be until Lyndon Johnson when you had a president who very directly and just he basically said damn the Southern whites and just passed every civil rights and voting rights law that Blacks ever wanted, and he really did not consider the political consequences for the Democratic Party's hold on the South. In doing so, that was a matter of conviction on his part to pass those laws. But most presidents prior to that, had been talking out of both sides of their mouths, trying to hold, the Southern whites, or try to convince Southern whites to vote Republican, or try to convince the few Blacks who had voting rights to vote either Democrat or Republican, based upon small gestures. And it was just a really tough thing to hold together. And we've seen how that's developed over the course of our history. It's been, there's rarely been a point in American history where the political interests of African Americans and Southern whites have been aligned to the point where they've been in the same political party. And that's true to this very day. The overwhelming majority of white Southerners vote Republican. The overwhelming majority of African Americans vote Democrat. And that's nothing new in the grand scheme of American history.
So we have a question from Paul Chadwick. When did lynching abate and why? World War II. And then our Coolidge Committee friend Rob Weir has a debate, or has it simply been made manifest in different ways? Police lynching, for example. Now, Coolidge endorsed the anti-lynching bill, but it did not pass on his watch. And at some point, he let up on pushing for it because he was worried about antagonizing some of those Congress people. Correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's one of the saddest, I think, aspects of the story, the inability of Congress to pass legislation blocking or federal anti-lynching legislation, making it a federal crime. And Coolidge, as you mentioned, supported anti-lynching legislation, but could not get it across the finish line. And succeeding presidents supported it, but failed. Some didn't support it, but it just, even actually at the height of the civil rights era, they couldn't get an anti-lynching law passed. So I think that's one of the most unfortunate aspects of the fight for civil rights, because it's just an appalling thing to think about, vigilante justice occurring in that way, people being dragged out of their homes or even dragged out of jail cells by mobs, and then people stringing them up and murdering them, and then taking parts of their bodies as souvenirs. Like it's truly appalling.
Question from Lisa Downing, Forbes Library's own. What is the most important thing you think we can learn from Coolidge today, either related to civil rights or otherwise?
Well, I think that the most important thing is that this is history that we should all know. I think that if we don't learn about the past, we are doomed to repeat it. And I don't think that, we can take the good things from Calvin Coolidge, and the less than good things we can set aside. Like as I said, I think his words about he speaks on many occasions very eloquently about the contributions of African Americans to society and to the war effort and that sort of thing on multiple occasions in his commencement address at Howard University, in his State of the Union address in 1923, et cetera, and his several different times he spoke positively about immigration and immigrants and whatnot. So, it's important to know how we got to the situation in the 20s. I see a lot of parallels between what happened as far as these very dark views of non-white Americans, and at that time non-whites were considered to include people from South and East Europe, like the Jews, and rhetoric that we hear today that's just very, very dehumanizing and discouraging, that we should never condone and tolerate any sort of racist speech or actions, or xenophobic speech or actions. And hopefully we can think of our fellow Americans regardless of their race or their nation of origin or the language that they speak, the religion that they practice, and the way that President Coolidge spoke of immigrants in 1926, when he said that no matter what craft we came in to get to the United States, we're all in the same boat now. We all rise and fall as one people.
All right. Any other questions? I don't see one in the queue. Julie, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, there's one more. The person says, I missed the very beginning. Did Rushad talk about how he got interested in Coolidge in the first place?
Oh, no, I didn't. That's a good question. There's actually a YouTube video of me talking about that as well. When I worked at the Coolidge Foundation, I was interviewed on Vermont Public Access TV. But I'm just a huge lover of history, and particularly presidential history. And I just have a deep, deep reverence for this nation's history. And I read Amity Schleye's biography of Calvin Coolidge that I think was released in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Hard to believe it's been that long, but very good biography of President Coolidge. And that really turned me on to Calvin Coolidge. And I met Amity at my grad school, Regent University in Virginia, in 2014, and told her how much I loved Coolidge, and then she ended up offering me a job at the Coolidge Foundation. So that's how I ended up at the Coolidge Foundation, and got to geek out about Coolidge professionally for 3 years, which was such a joy. I think I'm only 31, and I was at the Coolidge Foundation from ages 24 to 27. But those are definitely 3 of the best years of my professional life. And being able to work actually at the place where Coolidge was born and where he was sworn in as president. Bill Denny will tell you he's been there for many years, and it's just a true honor to be able to play a small part in preserving that truly unique history only in America. And I actually got to. Well, I don't think I ever played Coolidge in the reenactment that takes place in August every year at the homestead, but I narrated it several times, as Bill will tell you. And they don't perform it at 2:00 in the morning as it occurred in 1923. They do it at 2 in the afternoon. But it's great fun. And, American history is so textured, and there's so much to explore, and it's just such a a beautiful story, and I feel so connected to it because it's, you know, this is my country, and I feel like everything that's happened in the past has played a role in bringing me to where I am and everyone else to where we are. So I encourage everyone to read American history and to learn about our past. It's a great way to try to make our future better.
Got a question just came in from Vincent Jackson. What's your favorite Coolidge quote, and would you say that immigration was his foundational legacy as president?
Oh, what's his foundational legacy as president? And what is my favorite Coolidge quote? That's a difficult question because there are so many Coolidge quotes that I really love. I think, well, the President Coolidge has a quote that sums up what he thinks what he thought his administration's legacy was. He said that the most important accomplishment of my administration was minding my own business. So I think that sums it up. He was very, you know, I mean, we only talked about immigration and African-American civil rights in this discussion, but, you know, his presidency touched on many other issues. And he particularly, you know, Coolidge was a small government type of person. And I think it probably his most important accomplishment would have been the tax cuts that he pushed through, and shrinking the size of the federal government, which, you know, that was just that was the view that he had, that the federal government should be smaller and take less in taxes. So I think that probably would be the thing that he would be most proud of. And it's probably a tender mercy from God that Coolidge died right before Franklin Roosevelt became president, because I'm sure that living through the Roosevelt administration would have been pure torture for Calvin Coolidge.
Any more questions out there? Just Julie putting in the chat, Coolidge's answer to the New York dentist about when anyone can run for office, one of his more very blunt and forthright comments about racial equality.
Right. Yes, I didn't even mention that. Thank you, Julie, for bringing it up. But yeah, in 1924, an African-American candidate was selected to run for Congress from Harlem, in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance, when African-Americans were flooding into Harlem and making so many wonderful cultural contributions. And this dentist in New York was scandalized by the fact that the Republicans in that district had nominated a Black person to run for Congress. And Coolidge wrote this very eloquent letter back to the dentist, telling him that, you know, African Americans have every right to run for Congress. They've served in the war, and, you know, they've shown their patriotism, and there's no reason that the Republican Party should not welcome them as candidates for Congress. And not only did Coolidge send this letter to the man privately, but several days later he released the letter to the press. So there's a public record of this letter being sent for all the world to see. So I think that, you know, that, and this was also, of course, in 1924 when he was running for president himself. The campaigns were not quite as long as they are these days, but it was the late summer of 1924, I think August. So it would definitely not have been gone unnoticed when he made that gesture.
Any more questions in the queue, Julie?
I don't see any more there. Do we have anyone who wants to unmute and ask a question?
Well, hearing no further questions, I think we could wrap up. Thank you so much, Rushad. This was fantastic, extremely enlightening. If you go to our Forbes Library page on Coolidge's record on race issues, you will find a link to his 40-minute lecture where he gets even more detailed than this. And it's a wonderful lecture, so please check that out. Anything else you have to plug, Rushad?
Yeah, there's an embarrassingly large number of YouTube videos of me talking about Calvin Coolidge from when I was like 25 years old. So if you want to learn more, just Google Rushad Thomas, Calvin Coolidge. Lots of cool things online, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. You know, I work in policy in DC now, so I rarely ever get the opportunity to geek out about American history and President Coolidge in particular these days. So I'm grateful for Julie and the Forbes Library folks for inviting me to participate today. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you so much. And those who are interested in our presidential book club journey, we're only on Lincoln. We have ways to go till Coolidge and beyond. But you can. There's no harm in jumping in the middle. So hopefully, if you're interested in that, please contact us at Forbes Library. Contact Julie or myself. I think Julie put a link in the chat regarding that. Anything else for you to mention, Julie?
We always welcome new people to the Coolidge Committee, so certainly get in touch with us if you are interested. We're meeting on Zoom for now, so you don't have to live in Northampton. If you're interested in the work that we're doing, definitely you can email coolidge@forbeslibrary.org.
Thank you, all of you, for participating, and hope we can see you again soon.